like about music is that it stays with me through the week. We always remember during the week that the song, or one of the songs, or one of the hymns, or one of the praise songs, and that reminds me of what worship was about.
Music has impacted me emotionally mostly, as it draws out the soul more, and it gives more of a feeling that you can touch with and you can react with, as anyone can feel or hear music differently, and anyone
I was from a family that didn't go to church, but I went to church as a very little girl, and they got me in the choir and Sunday school, and the Lord became part of my life. And music is still very important to me, and with my husband, he loves music. And so it's just inside of me, and this is the way that I can express my faith to other people also. It's just wonderful. I love being in the choir. So I've been in choirs a long time, all my life, basically.
You know, I've always liked music in church, and the more gospel-y, the better. The more people get involved, the better. Just let it go. I really enjoy our second service here, and our first service is also very rewarding. It gives me a real depth in my heart, and I really do enjoy music, and I think it really just leads you to a better, deeper understanding of what church is, what Jesus is, and what our whole fellowship should be.
Music affects my faith by, because when you're singing a song about God, it sometimes tells you about what He has done for us, and it helps us learn better, because I know some people don't really listen when they're going strictly by the scripture, but they do it rather hearing how they said it by when they're singing instead.
My favorite musical times and memories in church usually revolve around songs that were on Elvis Sings the Gospel. And those songs are so filled with the Spirit of God to me. And I love to sing them at the top of my voice in church. I love How Great Thou Art and Let There Be Peace in the Valley. I love feeling that Spirit of God in church.
Well, music and Christian music has been a vital part of my whole development in life. I just think so many times how my spirit has been lifted by singing and being with people that enjoy singing. That's a big thing too. So it's really been a vital part of my life for many, many years.
As a couple, and so I grew up in my dad's Pentecostal church in Southern Virginia, with mother playing the organ and dad sometimes playing the trumpet and singing in the choir, and also played trumpet through high school, so music has been a very important part of my life. I was sung on worship teams and in choirs for many years, and I'm Mark Pierce.
Music has impacted my faith in tremendous ways. It always reminds me that I'm not the only one. It goes back, reminds me of history, people who have experienced things before me, and people who are experiencing the same thing as I'm experiencing now. And it calls me always back to God and what God does for us and through us and with us. That's music.
I have to say I'm really thankful for music, because I can remember from the earliest times in Sunday school, this is my Father's world, to now to contemporary music. It's just been such a natural thing God's given me, and I'm glad I'm able to share it.
That's awesome. Yeah, even though I do contemporary music, actually the most moving thing in my life is just the old hymns and the stories behind them. I'm just so moved. It is well with my soul. Just amazing story, and so many of the hymns have fantastic stories behind them.
I think music is very important in the church because it gives us a feeling of tranquility and sets the tone for a wonderful message from God.
Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus.
Singing in choir gives me such a sense of joy throughout the years. hymns that are particularly important to me, from memorial services, just from singing every Sunday, bring me such joy, strength, peace, and comfort. Being back in choir has been wonderful, has renewed that sense of happiness and joy within me, and looking at all the smiling faces in the congregation is awesome.
Music and worship in church has always been sort of part and parcel of why I've always come back to church. I sang in choirs when I was young. I accompanied choirs when I was young. And when I first came to WPC, that was one of the ways that I first got involved in church, was to join the choir. And I was in the choir for about 14 years before I got on to doing other things. So coming back to choir has been like coming back home. And music for me is just lifts your heart. It's a way of expressing the love of God and service to the people that we love and care for in this community.
Amen.
About a week and a half ago, after dropping off our oldest daughter, Ella, at kindergarten, Haley and Thomas and Piper and I, we drove to church. It was a Thursday, and Thomas, who turns 3 today, our boy who turns 3 today, was coming for his first time to the toddler and me class that our preschool does. And as we drove, I said, hey pal, what's your favorite part about church? What's your favorite thing about church? And I expected him to say Mrs. Boozer or Mrs. Velton, to one of his Sunday school teachers, or maybe he'd talk about the mud kitchen in the play area, or toys in the preschool classroom. But he didn't say any of those things. He blurted out, singing! Singing! And I said, huh? He's 3. Literally just turned 3. He can't read. He can't follow along in a hymnal. He doesn't know what's happening on the screens. He doesn't know if what he sings is in tune or not in tune. He does have a bit of rhythm, but unfortunately has his dad's dance skills. And yet singing was the first thing that he thought of. Thomas's answer reminded me of 2 realities. First is, you don't have to have any musical skill to worship. You don't have to have any musical skill to worship, but just like anything else, if you invest time in learning and being a part of a community that values music, you can develop and you can grow. And secondly, even though our kids are typically only in our worship service for a few minutes, they enjoy being with us. They want to belong, to be a part of our life together, to be a part of what we do as a church. Singing. It's what we do together as a church. Even when our wonderful choir is leading us, even when our worship team is leading us in a song that we are listening, you know, it's gifts that they bring to us, it's skills that they have. But we are participating. It is an experience that we share together. There's a passage in Colossians where Paul encourages the church to live their life together, to enjoy their time together. And I think it's fitting that he includes both music as an illustration and as an instruction. He writes this: as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, humanity, meekness, and patience. Bear with one another, and if anyone has a complaint against one another, forgive each other, just as the Lord has forgiven you. So you also must forgive. Above all, clothe yourself with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you are called, in the one body. And be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. Teach and admonish one another in all wisdom, and with gratitude in your hearts, sing psalms, sing hymns, sing spiritual songs to God. And whatever you do, in word or deed, do in everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This is a passage that I often use when I officiate weddings. And it's not specifically about a marriage relationship, but I use it for two reasons. First, it shows us how we should function with one another. So I encourage couples to be intentional with how they plan to live their life together. And secondly, I use it because of the context in which Paul wrote. Yeah, I love what Ron just said about the Ephesians passage, how one thing that music does is it connects us through the generations. Music connects us through the generations. And so often when we think of Paul's writing, we think of this foreign land in a foreign time. We think of a completely different culture. And his culture definitely was different than what we live in today, but there's some similarities as well. Paul wrote this letter while sitting in prison, addressing a church community that he hadn't visited yet, but he was very familiar with what was going on in their community, what was going on in their city. On one hand, there was a traditional voice. There were religious authorities that were pushing what was viewed as kind of a conservative way of living. So there was this traditional value, conservative way of life that was pushed, and then there was an even stronger presence pushing kind of a progressive Greek philosophy, a progressive Greek spirituality. And culture was rapidly changing. Along with that change came all kinds of fear and all kinds of uncertainty, all kinds of questions about how do we exist in the world today. I think we can ask that same question as a church today. How do we exist in the world today? There are some people who are comfortable with the new way of life, and others were clinging to a set of traditional rules and traditional values, most having to do with dietary customs and laws around cleanliness. Both groups claimed that their worldview was superior or more righteous than the others. And Paul essentially says to them, you're both missing the point. If you're following Jesus, you're called to a new life, one that looks radically different than what you're hearing and seeing around you. And he uses this first metaphor. The first metaphor has to do with our identity, has to do with clothing. He says, you're God's chosen people, dearly loved and holy. So when you wake up in the morning, when you get dressed, put on clothes of compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. And don't forget to love as well. Now, when I use this passage in weddings, I usually talk through each garment and how it takes work to take off our old garments and put on new garments, put on the new things that Paul lists. Compassion, it takes work. It's what happens when we take an emotion like pity and we're moved to do something. We're moved into action. In the Greek world, compassion is something that was visceral. It came from your gut. Something you respond to because you have this gut feeling, I should do this. Kindness, it also takes work. It's tangibly showing others that they matter, no matter who they are, what they believe, where they come from. Sometimes it's as simple as opening a door for someone or lending a listening ear. And sometimes it's more daunting. Approaching someone who needs a meal and taking them the meal and sitting with them and hearing their story. Kindness. One of my favorite stories about the impact of kindness comes from a young man who moved from a rural setting into a big city. The young man was seduced by all the things that the big city offered. A fast-paced job, nightlife, everything that comes with the big city. And after being there a while, he was befriended by a preacher. And he was confused by how this church person could be so nice, could be so kind to him. And they would get together and they would talk, and he was just confused. How is this church person being so kind to me? They became friends, so he came to church one day and he heard him preach. And he didn't like at all what he heard from the pulpit. But the preacher, for one reason or another, kept being kind to this young man who loved the big city. Long story short, as he got to know the pastor, he began to get to know the person of Christ. Eventually, what he heard in the pulpit made sense. And a few years later, this young man who was moved to the big city was led to Christ. That big city was Milan. The preacher was a bishop named Ambrose. And the young man was Augustine, one of the most influential figures in Western Christianity. Reflecting on his relationship to Ambrose, he once said, "I began to love him not at first as a teacher of the truth, but as a fellow creature who was kind to me." Kindness. Sometimes we can't know how far a small act of kindness will go. Paul then lists humility and gentleness, which are key for any relationship or any group that wants to exist in a world that's full of differences. The two virtues remind us that we're all on a journey, and we've all got struggles, and that we need to respect one another. And he calls us to patience. Putting on patience first thing in the morning reminds us that we're called to be a non-anxious presence in a chaotic and fast-paced world. A reminder I needed this morning when I was late getting to church and recognized, shoot, there's a race today. Anyone else need that patience reminder this morning? So those 5 garments: compassion, kindness, humanity, gentleness, and patience, all have to do with how we conduct ourselves, how we live life together. It's the sort of thing that I often tell my kids: you can't control what others do, but you can control what you do. And then in verse 14, Paul writes, "Above all else, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony." Moves from the metaphor of clothing to the metaphor of music. Love is the article that you put on that pulls the whole outfit together. Or as Paul puts it, brings us into perfect harmony. I think it's interesting that in this passage, in this list, this time here in Colossians, that Paul lists love last. In other places, like Galatians with the fruit of the Spirit, it's first. And the reality is that when Paul writes, love is central to his message. 1 Corinthians, he says it's the greatest gift. In Galatians, it's the chief motivator. It's behind all of what we do. And in Romans, he goes as far as saying that it's the summary of all of the commandments. So Paul starts with this statement about identity. You are God's people, holy and dearly loved. And he ends with how we live together, this picture of perfect harmony. He moves to a call to action for those of us who claim the identity which he starts with. And then he ends with an invitation to let the word of Christ dwell in us, which leads to teaching and learning and ultimately to singing. So as we celebrate what God has done through our music ministry this past year, through our choir, through our praise team, through the tech team, through all those that put together what we do on Sunday morning, we need to learn from Paul's call to live in perfect harmony, to show others compassion, to be kind, humble, gentle, patient, to put on love, to pull it all together. And my hope is that as we live into those virtues, that we would do them with the eagerness and the excitement that my son had when we drove to church and he started singing. Let's be a church that sings. Will you pray with me? Loving God, you call us and invite us to live as your people in this world. Help us to live into that identity with an enthusiasm that's inviting, that draws people nearer to you. We give thanks for our music ministry, for Ed, for Act Young, our choir, for our worship team, for our tech team, for all that you do through this church and the gift of music. We pray all these things in your name. Amen.